back to our 11th episode of Mindset Monday. I started this podcast during the pandemic as a passion project in high school, and I'm so excited to keep sharing these messages that Dr. Rohit Chandra and I care so much about. Today, we are talking about an urgent and timely topic on something that we need more of in our world today: empathy. In a U-Michigan study from 2011 on empathy in college students were found to be less empathic than ever before. In this 30-year study, there was a 40% drop in overall empathy score. Current U.S. college students are found to be the most self-centered, narcissistic, competitive, confident, and individualistic group to ever be measured. So what is happening here, and how can we prevent this? We need to consider how empathy is the driving force behind so many pressing issues: social innovation, educational reform, and even our new future of AI. My wise and wonderful co-host, Dr. Rohit Chandra, a child and adolescent psychiatrist at MGH, will help us dissect through this anatomy of empathy and make sense of how truly complex it is. So some questions I want us to think about throughout this episode: how do we make empathy scalable in a world that urgently needs it? How can we shift what we think about empathy for a better tomorrow? Great. So to start with some definitions. What is empathy exactly? And let's think about the anatomy of empathy. Dr. Chandra, where does it live inside our brain?
It sounds like you took a wonderful course, Sachi, at Dartmouth called The Anatomy of Empathy. That's a fascinating question. I did neuroscience research after college at Columbia University with Eric Kandel. And so neuroscience has always fascinated me. So empathy, I think one has to look at the division of the brain. So in terms of the neuroscience, the brain is divided in three parts evolutionarily. The most primitive part is called the lizard brain, and that is very much just instinct and, don't tread on me and survival. And then in evolution, then you have on top of that the mammalian brain. What dogs and, farmyard animals have in terms of being attached to each other. And then you have on top of that the primate and then human brain, the neocortex, which is more complex, which is very cognitive in nature. So empathy, you have the empathy of attachment. So the mammalian brain is very much about attachment. And I think empathy is really a big part of it is being attached to other people and connected to other people. And then you have, that's more, I would say, emotional empathy, where you're feeling what other people are feeling. And then you have the cognitive empathy, which is sort of more neocortical, which is kind of getting a sense of what others' world is, what another person's world is like. And that's often from careful listening and observation. But that's it keeps a bit of a distance from the emotions. So you have these three kind of, you have three elements of the brain. But emotional empathy, I would say, is more based in that mammalian brain. So the insula is one region. And then the sort of cognitive empathy is based in the neocortex or the cingulate cortex and the frontal lobe in general. But overall, I think, we are wired to be connected to each other. If you look at little kids, if they, at young ages, if they hurt another child, hopefully, well, maybe a little older than young, because at some point they seem to not care. But I think empathy comes online probably at ages 3 or 4. And then you see little kids being like, oh, I'm really sorry. They feel terrible if they hurt another child, and they start crying because they feel overwhelmed. So I think it is, it's wired in us. There are certain situations in which we don't have it. So kids on the autism spectrum may not develop that mentalization, that kind of cognitive empathy. They may not be able to really understand what others are going through. Those who have sociopathy or psychopathy, they may sort of know what others are feeling, but then not have that concern, that empathetic concern to be able to act on it. And they may use what they know for harm. But overall, most of us, I think, are really wired to be empathic. And this is just part of being human, that we are social creatures. Understanding and feeling another's perspective is something that we naturally do. And one can argue the opposite of empathy, that those who lack it, those who use it against others, that's almost the basis for human evil. If you're not attached to others, then you can really harm them. You can use them for your own purposes, treat them like pieces on a chessboard. But some of the most beautiful aspects of being human are, being connected to others, helping others, being part of a community, being part of a family. So empathy is just so crucial, for us as a species.
That's so interesting. And you mentioned something I always think about. So, empathy is innate. We're hardwired to be empathic. Can you talk a little bit about, what happens if empathy is getting diminished? We can bounce back from this. How can we regain an empathy if we feel?
Yeah, good point. So there's a wonderful psychiatrist at MGH named Helen Riess, and she wrote a book called The Empathy Effect. I met her at a conference years ago, and when she was actually preparing this book. So she studied empathy in a lab, basically had therapists and patients kind of wired. So she did a galvanic skin response. And what she found was, if a patient had some strong response to something that was asked, usually the therapist could pick it up because as therapists and patients get attuned, over time, therapists have a sense of what's going on with their patient. And if the patient, is in distress, it shows up in the galvanic skin response, which is almost like a skin version of the EKG. So you get this spike, and the therapist's, galvanic skin response also spikes in, kind of in at the same time. And so she was studying this, and then she also found that if the therapist was not attuned at a certain moment, that the patient's GSR spikes as they're talking about something like physical abuse, but they are very quiet about it, and they're just like, yeah, I was abused. The therapist doesn't follow up on that. That may be a bit of an empathic rupture because the patient does not feel totally understood. But in her study, she went back and compared these GSRs, and if there was one where the patient spiked and the therapist didn't, then she would go back and say, this is a moment you might want to revisit and ask more about in the next session. And so the therapist would, and that would open up a whole new kind of, open up a new door in therapy for exploration. And the therapist may also say, I recognize that I didn't notice that you were uncomfortable when you were talking about this. And I wanted to follow up on it. And the patient would be like, yeah, I wasn't sure if I should bring it up, or I felt uncomfortable bringing it up, but yes, I was abused. And sure, thanks for asking. I can tell you more about it. So that attunement, I think, is really quite beautiful. In her book, she says it can be learned. So as physicians, we ideally are attuned to our patients. There are aspects of the system that pulls us away. For instance, you might see your primary care doctor or other doctor typing while they write because there are expectations for completing notes on time. So that can pull us away from being really present with our patients. But if that has been lost, or if doctors aren't appropriately empathic, she has taught a method, and so she actually has an acronym, E.M.P.A.T.H.Y, and the E stands for eye contact, making sure they're making eye contact, the person feels seen. Really having the proper muscle facial expression, ideally smiling, and or at least looking like you're focused and interested, not frowning perhaps. P is for posture, so leaning in usually expresses interest. A is for affect, which is a psychiatric term for emotions, so having sort of positive emotions, so that encourages the person to speak. Having a tone of voice that is positive, that is encouraging, as opposed to being like, tell me about yourself, which you could see would shut down someone because you're saying the right thing, but your tone of voice is suggesting against their telling you about themselves. And then H is for hearing the whole person, so not just listening to their words, but also recognizing their body language, their facial expressions. And then the Y is for your response. So if someone says something that's very painful and you move on to the next question, like the therapist and the patient sort of being misattuned and to get that galvanic skin response showing that, if you're able to respond in a proper way and perhaps reflect back what the patient said to show the patient that you understood, perhaps show in your own face that it hurts to hear what the person's telling you. If something is painful, the person knows that they have been heard at a deep level, and that may encourage them to open up even further, and that can be cathartic. So, with deep empathic listening comes an empathic response that starts on a physiological level because of our shared brain activity, is a quote from the book. And the point is that, just like the GSRs kind of align, the brain activity in studies has also been shown to align. That two people, when they are kind of in tune or attuned to each other, their brain activity looks very similar. So it's fascinating. The fact that empathy can be learned is really marvelous.
That's amazing. I think it's so neat to capture something like this and
Mhm.
have that evidence and have that data that
Right.
actually suggests this shared brain activity between two people. I think it's really
Yeah.
powerful.
Right.
And just to also keep going on getting more into empathy and getting more into the spectrum of it,
Mhm.
can we talk a little bit about this spectrum of empathy? For example, from having no empathy all the way to almost having too much, right? Like
Right.
where's the line of when it becomes overwhelming for people.
Yeah, sure. So most people, again, have the capacity for it. The question is, how is it being used? Who is it being applied to? Um, because if we're really attuned to everyone, that is a lot. And I've always been fascinated by artists, those who are truly artists. They feel compelled to create. They feel compelled to write poetry. They feel compelled to paint. They feel, the drive to create music. And, one aspect of artists is that um, they tend to have more permeability to the outside world. They seem to be able to take in a bit more than the rest of us and use that and kind of mold it into something beautiful for which is created. The downside of that is that you can get compassion fatigue. You can get, they can have too much empathy and burn out. But that also applies to the rest of us. That if we are letting too much pain in, if we are empathic and letting too much pain in, it can be overwhelming. So, I think the spectrum, there are those who consider themselves empaths, and that word might be overused, but there are some people who seem like their dominant way of being is feeling with others and relating to others. And they have to be careful that they're not giving too much because their circuits can, in a sense, be fried. If too much sensory input comes in, if too much pain comes in from other people, it can overwhelm them, and they may need to distance themselves or avoid, the news or something for a while. Those of us who, have moderate levels of empathy usually are kind to our family members, we're kind to maybe colleagues, friends, our sort of circle. Um, those who are especially kind, maybe kinder to the community and to the world, and things like that. Then you have those who seem to lack empathy or seem not to apply it much to others. And, there, I would say, is where a lot of the world's problems lie. So those who may know what others are thinking and feeling, but have no concern for them and say, let me use them, or those who just don't seem to care. Those who don't have the capacity, or those who do, but do not actually, care about the outcomes. Um, but I think in terms of navigating, so, we may be in different places on the spectrum. We may also apply our empathy to different groups within our, if you look at the concentric circle between individual, we have concentric circles, individual, family, community, world. So how much are we applying our empathy to just ourselves and our families? How much are we extending it elsewhere? Um, but I think setting boundaries sometimes is helpful. If we are getting overwhelmed by media, if we are getting overwhelmed by the struggles of others, we may have to pull back at times for our own balance. So I think balance is the key word here. That one has to be able to, ideally, one is kind and empathic to others, but you also want to make sure that you're not getting burnt out from that, both in the moment and over time. So I know we talked about cognitive empathy as a way to kind of manage this. And cognitive empathy is really being able to uh, picture the worlds of others. So listening carefully or reading carefully to get a sense of what's going on and having that in one's mind. But that mental image, uh, is often sufficient. It's often sufficient in patient interactions where the person understands that you get them, but you don't have to then take in all their feeling. you don't have to absorb all of it. Likewise, when we're reading about what's going on in the world, while it's understandable to feel for all the sufferers in the world, it's often useful to be able to pull back a little bit and get a sense of what's happening, but not, but not absorb all of those negative feelings. So in medicine, if we, doctors are really trained to think of others first, at least in terms of modeling. When we were in medical school and we're on the wards, we were expected to make sure that we're taking care of patients and then secondarily taking care of ourselves. So there are patient care needs in inpatient settings or outpatient settings. You're expected to make sure you take care of patients first. So we're kind of wired to do that, and the demands of systems often can be overwhelming. The notes we have to complete, the referrals we have to manage, labs we have to check for patients, quality measures instituted by institutions. So sometimes, there's what's called burnout, or it's more properly called moral injury, when doctors who are wired to take care of patients first are now also being pulled by the system to make sure that systemic needs are met. And then, either if energy is pulled away from patients to take care of those system needs and what bosses want, then you can get moral injury because you feel like your patients are not being well taken care of. My closest friend dated someone who was an ER doctor, and that person eventually had more and more of a workload till he said, I can't do this safely. I don't feel like I'm taking care of my patients well. It's just not safe. And he left the job he was in to go to a different one where he felt that the system was better. So I think, and you can talk about Juliet Watt, but, there is compassion fatigue management. So it's a really interesting idea that there's a spectrum of empathy and how to manage it and to make sure you don't get overwhelmed. But then there are also those who may not have empathy or may kind of use what they do grasp against other people to cause trouble.
That's really fascinating. And I was reading about this, for on the spectrum, on the side of people that have no empathy, as we might say, and what happens when those people are in positions of power, and why it is so extraordinarily difficult to actually feel empathy for people that think very differently from you or have completely different life experiences. And that particularly with our current administration, with current political events, I find that this is such a root problem that and when it gets into these positions of power and it magnifies and the effects are just, there's violence and there's so much there, and so I really think it begins by the discussion of empathy and how to really feel for people that do not agree with you, have different political views, have different very different ideologies, and how that there's still space to have empathy for them, because that's so critical, getting at the cause of many of these issues.
Yeah, and that mammalian brain can be weaponized. So the fact that we're attached to each other, we feel a sense of group belonging. Dogs, have their affiliative group. Humans have their affiliative group. We identify with others who are similar to us in skin color, in religion, in whatever way, in class perhaps. But that can be weaponized by unscrupulous people in power to kind of fragment society. I have Bosnian patients, and they say in the 90s, they said, things were fine under Tito, who was a socialist leader. And then when he, kind of came out of power, maybe passed away in the late 70s, then there was a power vacuum. And eventually Milosevic filled that power vacuum. And eventually people who didn't care about what someone else's religion was, what someone else's background was, we're all neighbors. We just know each other. We're just part of a social fabric. The differences don't bother us. Now they are being told, you're a Bosnian Muslim. The Croatian Catholic is your enemy. The Serbian Orthodox person near you is your enemy. And each group was kind of told the same thing, that, we are we have to protect ourselves. These people are devils or otherwise subhuman. And each group was told this, and they eventually started to fight. And it was a brutal war with lots of massacres, genocides. I mean, so it really was pretty terrible. But this can be used by politicians, by religious leaders, by cult leaders, whatever, all sorts of unscrupulous leaders against people. The fact that we are sort of group-minded at times, and while that's protective, it can also lead to fissures and divisions. And likewise, I think victimization. So who's a victim? Because we empathize with victims. We feel pity for people. When we feel pity for people, we really, we say, okay, this person can do whatever they want. They've been victimized. So how do you, so sometimes like I have patients who are in custody conflict. So they're kids, they have shared custody, and one parent is extraordinarily cruel to the other parent and probably to the kids. But the parent who's cruel often will go into court and start crying and act like a victim. And then the legal system isn't sure what to do about this. They can't figure out which person is telling the truth, but the person who's crying seems like the victim. So that person gets the benefit of the doubt. And then the law sides with that person against perhaps the good parent. And that's kind of a very painful way in which our capacity for empathy is kind of used in destructive ways. But in general, I think we care for others, and when we are told others or our group is being victimized, we will defend our group and kind of want to attack another group. So again, this can be used in ways that are not pro-social. So,
Very interesting. Yeah. And so, we've talked a lot about empathy and, the spectrum of empathy and where it lives in our brain. And now I'm curious for our audience, how can we exercise our empathy muscle if it's something that we can build and if it's something that is malleable? How can we improve it in our daily interactions and strengthen it? Kind of coming
yeah.
back to the audience.
Great point. There's the quote that even though life is getting better by every conceivable standard, more people are feeling hopeless, depressed, and alone. And I think our connection is an example of how of what we can do. So you and I met through Setu, which is a Indian acting troupe, and Setu means bridge, and this troupe tries to build bridges across cultures. So I think being able to sort of connect to those who are different from you, so certainly connecting to those who may be similar to you, but also finding ways to build bridges and listen to others who are different, hear other perspectives, read literature, because literature takes you into other people's worlds and gives you that kind of cognitive empathy. So you can say, okay, this is someone else's world. Interesting. It's very different from mine, but this is a valid experience. It takes us out of our own kind of silo. So and traveling is very helpful. Traveling takes you to different worlds physically, and you see how other people live, and you say that you realize there are good people everywhere. And they may live quite differently than us. They have, their land produces different sort of, they may have a lot of lumber, so their houses are built with wood. They may have aluminum, and so now their roofs have aluminum. You're like, huh, that's interesting. Their land produces certain foods, so that's what they eat. But travel gives you a sense of the fact that not everyone is like you, and that's okay. And there's richness in connecting to those who are different. And at work, for instance, I have a lot of patients, I said, who are refugees, and hearing their stories just reminds me that other people have different lives. So the arts help us get into other people's worlds. Travel helps us physically be in other people's worlds, groups of people. So those I think are quite helpful. But overall, just recognizing that we are one person. There are something like 8 billion people on this earth, and not everyone has our experience. And hearing other people's perspectives, exposing oneself to different perspectives, I think is often helpful.
Yeah, and I know you had shared with me Emily Smith's TED Talk, where she kind of talks about meaning, and if we want to think about empathy, then we should also talk about finding meaning,
Yeah.
belonging, and serving something that's other than yourself. That's really the key to this true happiness that can come
Yeah.
from empathy for others, contributing to a larger group, volunteer work. So
Mhm.
there are just so many ways that you can actively participate in
Right.
improving your empathy and
Yeah.
also finding that fine balance between not having to absorb the problems of the world.
Right.
Because if you do that, if you find that balance, I think that's
Yeah.
so key that you said, you can potentially contribute in a better way
Mhm.
rather than becoming overwhelmed by it and actually make more of an impact, I think. And I wanted to just add in, you had shared with me a piece of work from the Scientific American, and talks about Stanford psychologist Jamil Zaki, who worked with Dr. Carol Dweck. And I wanted to just mention, of course, that she is the inspiration for this podcast. Her work talks about how your mindset can affect your performance. And so, people that have a fixed mindset, for example, thinking that they're powerless to change their intelligence or how well they perform, is very different from having a growth mindset, a
Right.
can-do attitude, and believe that your performance is improved with effort. And so this psychologist worked with Dweck actually to look at how growth mindset exists within empathy. And so I really want our listeners to take this away, that people who believed that their effort could change their level of empathy were more likely to take the perspective of someone from a social outgroup than those who believed that empathy was this stable, fixed, unchanging trait. And so I think that's really empowering to think about it.
That's beautiful. Yeah, we actually do have to work at it. We have to put ourselves in situations in which we can be useful, and then we find that this multiplies upon itself. When I was a first-year medical student, I was working at Boston University School of Medicine on the homeless outreach van, and would do that maybe every other Tuesday for several months. And this was my first semester as a medical student. And one day I was standing at the bus stop waiting for the bus to go home, and there were probably 20 other people with me. There was a woman who was well dressed, but had matted hair and kind of dirty feet, and she seemed very agitated. She came up to me and others and said, "Do you know how to get to Belmont? Do you know how to get to Belmont, Massachusetts?" And I said, "I don't think this bus goes there. The farthest it goes is Harvard Square, not to Belmont." I said, "Okay." And then she ran across the street and presumably went to another bus driver and said, "Do you know how to get to Belmont?" And I was watching this, and then the bus went along, and she crossed the street. There was an island in the middle. She crossed the street to the island, but in front of a Mack truck. And the Mack truck blared its horn and stopped. And she like waved at it and then got to the island, got to the island. And I was watching this, and everyone else was watching this. And I just walked across the street, went to the island, and said, "Please do not." And I took her hand. I said, "Please do not cross the street in front of traffic. I can help you get to Belmont." She said, "I have to get there. I have to get there. My boyfriend beat me up. And I need to get home to my dad. I live with my dad. He's 87 years old, and I need to get there." I was like, okay. Yeah, so let's wait. This next bus is coming, but do not cross the street right now. The light will turn red. We can cross. We'll get on the bus. I'll help you figure it out. The bus driver can help you figure it out. So we got on the bus, and she started to unspool this story of having been, somewhat wealthy, but then having had some terrible things happen to her, sexual assault and some others, and then really kind of falling down in life, struggling significantly, and then apparently was with this very abusive boyfriend. And she had just gotten beaten up, and she wanted to go home to her dad, and she didn't know how to get there. So I spoke with the bus driver, and I gave her some information on domestic violence, but went home and said, I was thinking about gross anatomy, my gross anatomy test, and how far I am behind in studying, the muscles of the hand. I guess it all doesn't really matter compared to what this lady is going through. And both are true. I mean, it does matter. I mean, it matters for me to be able to do my work. But the point is, other people are suffering. And how can we help those who are suffering? If we are in positions, if we have the skill set, it makes it easier for us to have what is called empathic concern or empathetic concern and do that. So ideally, we put ourselves in positions where we are volunteering, where we are being useful to others. And then you find more and more needs, and you can help more and more people. You obviously have to find the balance between helping others and taking care of yourself and your family, if you have a family, or take care of your friend group, if you have a close group of friends, because you don't want to be pulling away from everyone else to give to those you don't know necessarily or know well. But I think being part of something bigger than yourself, recognizing that you can have a positive effect on others, and recognizing where there is suffering or where there is need, and being able to fill those needs makes us feel useful and provides meaning for life. Whereas just working or studying, planning for a career, just thinking of oneself and what's good for oneself ends up being kind of empty. It might feel good for a while, and if we succeed academically, if we make a lot of money, if we impress our communities with how talented we are, how wealthy we are, it can feel good. But in the end, it can also, you start to feel like, what else is there? And that's when I think, it's helpful to be part of something bigger than yourself, give to others. And when what we give is what we keep in some senses, that when we give to others, we get the benefit of that. We get the benefit of, we give away love. If we're loving, we just feel something good within us. So I think giving paradoxically enables us to be rich, rich kind of spiritually.
That's that's amazing. I think that
Yeah.
there's so much there, and thank you so much for this conversation because I think I personally was really jarred and shocked by that empathy in college students. And as a college student myself, I know I'm going to take away a lot into how I
Right.
can bring empathy into my future
Yeah.
work and my career and my goals in
Yeah.
medicine. And so I really hope that our audience can take something away about building empathy as something that's malleable and it's
Yeah.
within us, but we can
Right.
actively exercise and practice
Yeah.
that muscle in a
Mhm.
world that desperately needs more of it. In the description of our video, you will find many of the links and resources that we were talking about in this episode on the mindset on empathy. So I really hope that all of you have something that you can learn from this, and please share this video with your friends and family to help build an empathy community.
Mhm.
Great.
Thanks, Sachi. That was a delight.
Thank you.